Two burial plots shroud the small Catholic church at Brush Creek in rural Missouri. One is speckled with white limestone and granite markers, as pleasing in appearance as lilies of Easter, with names and places and birth and death dates etched into their faces. Kentucky, from which many of the deceased came, is engraved on several stones. In the second plot, memories are lost, no names, no dates, no places. Until archaeologists found the remains of mortals there were no markers. Today, the shadows of a few dozen small white crucifixes bless the graves as the sun moves across the soil where those bodies were found. They are the graves of forgotten slaves whose black hands worked the soil to raise tobacco and grain and vegetables there. In St. Peter Catholic Church at Brush Creek, Martha Jane Chisley and Peter Paul Tolton were married in the spring of 1851. The woman, Martha Jane, was part of a dowry, a batch of slaves, as it was recorded, that Susan Manning received in 1849 when she married Stephen Elliott at her father's plantation in Meade County, Kentucky. Martha Jane Chisley's mother and brothers were not part of that dowry and not with the newlyweds, the Elliots, when they took Martha Jane and the rest of their property with them to Rolls County, Missouri. To them and to slavery were born Charles in 1853, Augustine John on April 1st, 1854, and Anne in 1859. The children were raised in the religion of their owners. The Elliots were Catholics. Father John Sullivan baptized each of the Tolton children into the Catholic Church soon after their births. The priest's given name was entered on the birth record at Brush Creek as the second name for the second child, Augustine John Tolton. Of possessions, his name was the full extent of what Augustine John would ever own. This was what the boy knew. People of his color were born. They ate, they slept, they worked long and hard, and they died. Their Catholicism did little to ease their earthly suffering, which came to them by only the circumstance of a color with which they were born. That was physical suffering. As he matured, Augustine John would also come to know an emotional suffering endured by his race, stings because of his skin, even in his own church. Tolton family history claims that Peter Paul Tolton, the boy's father, fled his owners to join the Union Army as the Civil War began in 1861, that African Americans were prohibited from military service until 1863 make that unlikely, but it was known that the father Tolton had grown increasingly agitated, that there would be no end to his bondage. Peter Paul Tolton fled Brush Creek. In 1862, the threat of slave traders in Northeast Missouri compelled Martha to flee Brush Creek with her children. Her sense of duty had been informed by her own separation a decade earlier from her mother and siblings. With her children, she fled the Elliott place. Martha Jane was not known to have been in Quincy, but its reputation as a refuge for fugitive slaves was commonly known by that time. A group of Quincy men and women in August of 1835 created the first anti-slavery society in Illinois, and the first of the three major Illinois Underground Railway stations was organized here. Rescued by a handful of Union soldiers when accosted by Confederate soldiers while fleeing Missouri, the mother Tolton and her three children in 1862 made their way to Quincy. Here they joined other folks who had broken away from slavery. The young Tolton family lived for several years with Mrs. Mary Ann Davis, a widow with a 9-year-old daughter not quite a mile from the river. Each of the women worked, Martha as a daytime factory worker and Mrs. Davis as a housekeeper in a downtown building. Their staggered hours assured that the children were looked after. Family tradition, as well as Brush Creek lore, is that the Elliots freed Martha Chisley Tolton and her children. Elliott descendants tell us that Susan was close to Augustine John, serving as his godmother when he was baptized. The evidence indicates the Elliots let the family go. The Toltons became well known in Quincy, which would have made them vulnerable to capture. There is no evidence to indicate that the Elliots pursued them in any way. Within the year after they arrived in Quincy, Martha Jane, Charlie, and Augustine began work in the Harris Tobacco family factory at 8th and Ohio, a busy manufacturing area on the city's southwest side. At 8 a.m. each day, the Toltons joined other African Americans at their stations, rolling wrinkled tobacco leaves into fine cigars from crops raised, harvested, and aged by slaves in Missouri. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, as stemmers, cutting out coarse stems so that only the tenderest parts of the tobacco leaves would be rolled. The older son, Charlie, always a frail boy, during the winter of 1863, caught a cold from which pneumonia developed, and at 10, he died. The Harris factory closed during winter months, allowing Augustine, now called Gus, to enroll in St. Boniface Catholic School. From their arrival in Quincy, the Toltons attended St. Boniface Church, which served primarily the city's large German Catholic population. The church sponsored a parish school, and Martha Tolton succeeded in enrolling son Gus. But the presence of the Black child created dissension in the parish. White parents threatened to withdraw their children from the school and their membership from the church. The boy's life was intolerable. Children taunted him because he could not read and mocked his speech. In less than a month, his mother agreed with parish priest, Father Herman Schaefermeyer, to withdraw Gus from the school. The family continued to attend the church, seated in the narthex. In that corner, Gus learned German. There were 4 Catholic parishes in Quincy at the time, one, St. Lawrence O'Toole, founded in 1839. St. Lawrence's parishioners were mostly Irish. Its pastor was Father Peter McGurr, a strong-willed Irish immigrant himself. In that day, a pastor could name his parish church for his own patron saint. Father McGurr renamed his parish's Catholic church, St. Peter. If McGurr had suffered privation in Ireland and a sense of loss by separation from his family, he could not know the suffering like the child to whom he would serve as patron. Gus Tolton, by fate alone, had been born into a family of slaves in the slave state of Missouri. In free Illinois, he learned just as much about privation, insult, and intimidation. In 1868, Father McGurr was called to provide last rites to the daughter of Mrs. Davis, with whom the Toltons had lived 6 years now. Gus Tolton was among those praying for the 16-year-old girl when she died of tuberculosis. McGurr learned that Gus, for 2 months, had been attending Colored School Number 1, a public school in a small log cabin on the north side of Quincy. The priest insisted that the Catholic teenager attend a Catholic school, and he arranged the boy's enrollment at St. Peter's School. Teachers of the School Sisters of Notre Dame prepared the school's children for the arrival of their first Black student. Although older and taller than his schoolmates, Gus found young friends in school. Not so with parishioners. The parish family had grown to 1,500 under Father McGurr's pastorate. While building his parish, Father McGurr, quote, did his best to break down the clannish, nationalistic attitude of his parishioners and welcomed non-Irish families into the parish. He told his parishioners, Christ died for all, and all included Blacks. It consoled his Black parishioners and silenced others. Gus continued to work at the tobacco factory and attended St. Peter's School for 3 months a year. He memorized the Latin Mass and its prayers. He made his first communion and was confirmed in 1870. He became a sacristan, assisting the priest during the daily celebrations of the Mass before he went to work. Noting the piety of his young protege, McGurr asked Tolton about his interest in the religious life. It was the discussion that launched Gus Tolton's journey to the priesthood, a lengthy and difficult one, but none were easy. Several local priests took up Tolton's cause. Father Schaefermeyer, whose interest in Gus continued, by this time had left to join the Franciscan order. Before doing so, he set up an account to assist with the costs of Gus seminary training. Gus's own application to become a Franciscan postulant, a candidate to the Franciscan order, was turned down. Father McGurr made inquiries to seminaries throughout the country. Not one was ready for a Negro student. As a result, Quincy priests began Gus's ecclesiastical education here. Father Francis Ostrop, pastor of St. Boniface, obtained a seminary study plan, and he and assistant pastor Father Thomas Wegman tutored Gus from 1873 to 1875. Gus continued work as a janitor at St. Peter's during his formation, this time under Father Francis Reinhardt, who founded St. Mary Church in Quincy. Quincy in the late 1870s was home to about 3,000 African Americans, some Catholic, most of whom, however, had stopped attending church. Francis' father, Michael Richards, and Gus started a Sunday school at St. Francis. Gus Tolton recruited children from the Negro district in Quincy. In 1878, when no others would do so, the Franciscans at St. Francis, today's Quincy University, enrolled the 24-year-old Gus Tolton as a student. Their Franciscan fathers, Richard, Engelbert Guy, and Francis Albers, provided the education Tolton would need on his journey to become a priest. The search for a seminary in this country failed, but the appeals of Fathers McGurr and Richard to the superior cardinal of the Propaganda Fide, a seminary in Rome, which trained priests for mission work, did not. Richard wrote a detailed biography of Tolton and his efforts to get into the seminary and the reason, his race. He was denied. A reply took months, but when it came, it announced that the Propaganda Fide in Rome had accepted Gus Tolton. Leaving Quincy in February, Gus, on March 12, 1880, arrived in the Piazza di Spagna, where his eyes would rise up the three-story brick building to see the face of his home for the next 6 years, the Collegium Urbanum de Propaganda Fide. All his classes, philosophy, theology, church law, doctrinal studies, were in Latin. But trained by the Quincy Franciscans, he was prepared. Trained as a missionary, Gus expected to be assigned to Africa, and during his 6 years at the Propaganda, he dove deeply into the study of African cultures and languages. On Good Friday, 1886, the day before his ordination, Cardinal Giovanni Simeoni of the Propaganda told Tolton that the decision was to return him to the Diocese of Alton and Quincy. He would return to the place where his first school had rejected him, where seminaries across the nation had rejected him, and where religious orders had rejected him. Before the 20th century, the Catholic Church considered the United States a mission country, and the prefect cardinal knew of the many African Americans in the US who needed evangelization. Quote, "America has been called the most enlightened nation in the world," the cardinal said. "We shall see whether it deserves that honor. If the United States has never before seen a Black priest, it must see one now," end quote. On April 24th, 1886, Holy Saturday, Gus Tolton, 32, was ordained Father Augustine Tolton. Cardinal Simeoni arranged for the new priest to celebrate his first Mass at St. Peter Basilica, the building most identified by Catholics with their Catholicism throughout the world. Father Gus Tolton, 32 years old, returned in triumph to Quincy on July 17, 1886. A large crowd greeted him at the Quincy Railroad Depot just up the bank from the Mississippi River, which he and his mother, brother, and sister had crossed so many years earlier. A brass band played "Holy God, We Praise Thy Name," Father Tolton's favorite hymn since childhood. Father McGurr had arranged for a carriage pulled by 4 white horses to take Father Gus to St. Peter Church. There, school children, Quincyans, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, and priests of the diocese welcomed the nation's first Black Catholic priest. Father Tolton said the 9 a.m. Mass the next day at St. Boniface. Father McGurr preached the homily, the story of a Black child's long and arduous path from slavery to the priesthood. For 3.5 years, Father Tolton pastored St. Joseph Church at 7th and Jersey, an African-American mission church of St. Boniface. Once again, controversy followed. Now it was the constant presence of whites at St. Joseph, the cause. Whites, as well as Blacks, stood in line to have Father Gus hear their confessions, grant absolution of their sins, advise them spiritually. Masses at St. Joseph were standing room only for Black and white, even some non-Catholics, and Father Gus welcomed them. Because his Black parishioners had so little for the collection, the priest knew that his poor parish depended on the generosity of whites to pay for the work of his church and school. Here, for the first time, Father Tolton experienced racism from a fellow priest. The dean of the Quincy Deanery, which made him something like the superior of other Quincy priests, Father Michael Weiss of St. Boniface, influenced Bishop James Ryan of the Alton Diocese to instruct Father Tolton that he was to exclude whites from his church and minister only to African Americans. This meant that Father Tolton had to find other ways to finance his church. To raise money, he took distant speaking engagements to places like Washington, Baltimore, New York, Boston, Galveston, places where people were interested in hearing the first Black Catholic priest. Still, Father Weiss was not satisfied. He suggested Father Tolton go elsewhere. Tolton wanted to, but his vow to obey the Propaganda Fide's assignment prohibited his moving. Under a siege of sorts, Father Tolton wrote to the cardinal at the Propaganda and pleaded for transfer. The cardinal exchanged correspondence with Alton Bishop Ryan, who commended Father Tolton but complained, quote, "He wants to establish a type of society here which is not feasible in this place," end quote. The cardinal permitted Father Tolton to go to Chicago to serve the large African-American population there, and Archbishop Patrick Fian welcomed him. On December 19, 1889, Father Tolton left Quincy. His sister Anne and mother Martha Jane accompanied him. St. Joseph closed its doors permanently. Father Tolton's work with the African-American population wore heavily on him. He lived as his parishioners lived, in a home, poorly furnished, eating simple meals. A visiting priest reported that as soon as the evening meal was over, all knelt on the bare floor as Father Tolton led them in prayer. It was evident to the visiting priest that Father Tolton was exhausted. Just before noon on Friday, July 9, 1897, with the temperature hovering at 105 degrees, Father Tolton got off a train from a suburban convocation of priests. He started toward his rectory. Witnesses said he swayed, then toppled to the sidewalk. He was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors and nurses attended him throughout the afternoon, but he did not recover. A chaplain administered prayers of extreme unction, and he died that night, his mother and sister at his bedside. In accordance with his wishes, Father Tolton's body was returned to Quincy and buried in St. Peter's Cemetery. In directing his place of rest, Augustus Tolton ignored the suffering he had known here. This was instead the place of his first communion, his confirmation. This was the place where he had learned prayers of the Mass and served as a sacristan. This was the place where he had discerned his vocation to the priesthood, where he had found good fathers willing to look beyond the one circumstance that made him different. His remains were buried in the city in which he had known tragedy and triumph. On February 24th, 2011, Cardinal Francis George of the Chicago Archdiocese signed a proclamation for the cause for the beatification and canonization of Father Augustus Tolton. It was the first step for Father Tolton's path to sainthood in the Catholic Church, for a heroic life of joy and faith in the face of long suffering. On February 13th, 2012, the Sacred Congregation for Causes of Saints at the Vatican granted the title Servant of God for Father Tolton, the second major step toward canonization, and authorized the Archdiocese to inquire into his life and virtues. On December 10th, 2016, Father Tolton's body was exhumed, another step in the march towards sainthood. Most recently, on June 17th, 2021, Pope Francis elevated the Quincy priest status to Venerable Father Augustus Tolton. Two miraculous healings without medical intervention, linked to prayers for Father Tolton's intercession, remain the last steps before sainthood. One has been submitted for review. When confirmed, Father Tolton would be declared blessed. Another miracle will make him a saint. When Father Tolton becomes a saint, his shrine is expected to be in Quincy at his church, the descendant of his St. Boniface Catholic Church. His church will be the place in which he is welcomed home.